But there's something about Van Gogh's legacy which is much more important than his fathering this or that ism of modern art. Vincent's passionate belief was that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. It's the 10th of June and 130 years ago today, in Auvers-sur-Oise, Vincent van Gogh wrote a letter to his brother Theo about Sunday and about the events that happened on Sunday. Apparently the weather was good, and apparently his brother and sister-in-law and his little nephew Vincent came through and spent a pleasant day in Auvers-sur-Oise with Dr. Gogh and with Vincent. So we're going to talk about that in this episode. For my patrons following on this channel, the Kessinger tapes, which is usually every Wednesday, is going to be pushed over to tomorrow, just for this week, just so that I can pay a little bit more attention to the Laurie Vallow case. I do want to put up a sort of a map the area where the human remains were found. So that's likely to be on this channel a little bit later today. Chad Daybell was charged today with various counts. I've covered that on Patreon. In terms of Madeleine McCann, just think about how it's taken barely a year to find the remains of these two children, whereas Madeleine McCann's 13 years later. And I don't think Madeleine's still alive, but if she's not alive, where are her remains? So I will be finalizing my coverage of the Madeleine McCann case, but it's just also being pushed slightly back because of current events. In any event, if you're interested in this kind of true crime coverage and you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So just as in the Laurie Vallow case, I think it's quite important to contextualize where one is, and the same applies to Van Gogh. Auvers-sur-Oise geographically is quite an odd, idiosyncratic place, and interestingly, when Theo and his wife and child traveled there, they didn't get off the train at Auvers-sur-Oise or at that station. That's the station where I got off at, and it's kind of quite disorientating because you get off at the station and then you're not quite there, if that makes sense. The station at Auvers-sur-Oise is kind of closer to the Valmondoise area. I must really show you the map where I stayed sometime soon, before July, yes, so Auvers-sur-Oise, the actual station, is actually quite far along this sort of strung out town, whereas Shoppin Well is kind of early on the railway track. It's sort of it's kind of, if you think of it as like a long ladder, Auvers-sur-Oise is near the top end of the, I'm talking about the railway tracks, the station Auvers-sur-Oise is near the one end of the ladder, and Shoppin Well is near the other end of the ladder, and the actual town of Auvers-sur-Oise is actually kind of the rungs in the middle of the ladder, if that makes sense. Shoppin Well is kind of a station you reach kind of early on, and that is also on the side of town where Dr. Gogh's house is. And then as you go further along the town, the houses become, I guess, slightly smaller, and it just becomes, it's not necessarily a poorer area, but it's just sort of a different area. And there's also the sort of center of town, I guess. So Shoppin Well is kind of a quieter part of town. It's, I guess, the outskirts of Orvez on the one side, whereas the Orvez-Jouars station on the other side is kind of also on the outskirts, but just sort of quite a lot further along. But I will show you what we're talking about in more detail. The point is that Theo kind of got off at the station kind of closer to Dr. Gachet's home. I'm not entirely sure whether he got off at a station that I think there was another station that was kind of a lot closer to the Ravu Inn. So what I'm trying to get at is Theo was essentially visiting Dr. Gachet, not necessarily Vincent, if that makes sense. If you just think of where Theo got off at the station, he got off closer to Dr. Gachet's home than to Vincent's home, which I think is sort of interesting and sort of giving you the sense that it was more a visit, or it felt more like a visit of Dr. Gachet than of Vincent. Now, whatever you make of that statement, you might disagree, but whether you do or not, I think the point that one's got to, the question that one's got to ask around this whole time is, did Theo visit Vincent again between now, the 10th of June, and his death on the 29th of July? So in the essentially 40 to 50 days, basically a month and a half or so, did they see one another again? And if memory serves me, I don't think Theo came to Orvez again, but I do think at some point Vincent went to Paris, and I think there was a bit of an argument in Paris. I think there's a bit of a, wasn't a very good visit, that particular visit. I speak under correction though, because I'm talking from memory, but we're about to find out over the course of the next 20 days in June and then the last 30 days in July. So let's deal with the letter addressed to Theo and Joe, and it's written on Tuesday the 10th, the same day that he wrote to Mrs. Genu, or I think he received a letter from Mrs. Genu. He would actually write a reply, I think, the very next day, which is what we'll look at tomorrow. So Vincent writes, "Dear brother and sister, Sunday has left me a very pleasant memory. In this way, we really feel that we're not so far from one another, and I hope that we'll see each other again often." So it's kind of, in the very first sentence or two, he's already saying, it's good seeing you, I hope I'm going to see you again. And that's kind of what I'm saying is, did they see one another again? Vincent's hoping that they're going to see one another regularly, but is that very realistic? Now bear in mind, Vincent's kind of a freelancer, a kind of an unemployed vagabond in a way, and Theo is kind of the busier sibling. He's the guy with a proper job, with a wife, with a child, and Vincent is kind of expecting his brother to come and visit him often, and maybe to some extent that expectation is valid because of his illness, except that you'll see later in this letter, he kind of tells his brother, I think I'm completely cured. Well, if that's the case, well then, why must we come visit you? You come visit us. You're just one person. We three people. It's expensive, and also we've got other things going on. Can you kind of come along and tag along, rather than, us going, all of us decamping and going to you each time, right? And that's kind of the unfair aspect, is Vincent sort of has some kind of illness, but then he sort of needs care, needs attention, but then it's difficult to go and see him, and he's in a situation where he doesn't want to go and see someone else. Do you see that? Anyway, he goes on to say, since Sunday I've done 2 studies of houses in the greenery. And so these 2 studies included a painting called Thatched Cottages and Houses, and another one called thatched cottages. Now, I really love the thatched cottages and houses, so much so that I actually have a print of that in my bedroom. It's not the biggest picture in the bedroom, but it is one of two pictures. The other one is also from Auvers-sur-Oise, and I just really love that particular picture. It's just a calm, pleasant country sort of setting, and it's a nice picture to wake up to. It's sort of a simple but friendly, happy picture, right? And the other picture is also really a nice one as well, and just shows you what kind of setting Auvers is like. No paintings or photos can really do that place justice. It's just a very charming, unusual, lovely setting. It's really worth visiting. He goes on to say, since Sunday, he says, since Sunday, a whole colony of Americans has installed itself beside the house where I am. He says they paint, but I haven't yet seen what they do. So Auvers is the kind of place where people go, or people travel to paint because it's so scenic. It is famously picturesque. When I was there, there were also a couple of American tourists, not a colony of them, but you would sort of, I traveled by myself, and I went to see certain things, and I was investigating certain things and photographing certain things, and every now and then you would cross paths with a couple or a small group of people, or a trio, I guess, of Americans. And I remember there being I think 2 or 3 young American girls at Dr. Gachet's house, and it was quite a weird moment. I don't know, it was just a weird moment, them being there, and I was traveling alone, and I simply didn't talk to them, and they didn't talk to me, and it's just something I remember. And I remember at the time also thinking of Van Gogh, and thinking, did people think of him as an oddball, and did he also struggle to, how can I put it, did he struggle to just, how can I put it, just to be acknowledged by people, or did they sort of look down on him? Did they sort of look at him and say, well, okay, you're an old guy with nothing going for you? And I imagine that is kind of how he felt. So that I kind of reflected on that day when I went to Dr. Gachet. And I kind of had a totally different experience traveling in the footsteps of Vincent van Gogh, because I did it by myself. And also I wasn't just taking photos, I was trying to retrace very important parts of his journey, and I was doing it chronologically. So people that I encountered in Auvers were just in Auvers, whereas I'd come from Arles, and I'd travelled from Arles to Auvers at around about the same time that he did. So it wasn't just like, well, I'm here and so is everybody else. My journey was by train. I was traveling, also traveled through Paris, traveled back to Paris as well. So it was quite a moving experience for me. And that's, I guess, part of why I wanted to do this series, is just to kind of honor that journey. And I still want to write a book about it. I'm meant to be doing that now, but I've kind of got a little puppy to take care of. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to do that in July, but we'll see. But that was my experience. Anyway, he goes on to say, on reflection as regards taking that house or another one, here's what there is. So obviously it seems like they discussed during their meeting on Sunday his lodgings. The doctor and Theo sort of spoke about maybe you should stay somewhere else or something. and because his little room is very small, very modest, and in summer it would have been very, very hot. He says, here I pay 1 franc a day for my bed. So if I had furniture, and this is in italics, the difference between 365 francs and 400 wouldn't, in my opinion, be of very great importance. And then I'd very much like you to have a pied-à-terre in the country at the same time as myself. I think that means like a place to stay in the country, something like that. So he's still talking about if he had his furniture, he would be able to stay really modestly. But of course he doesn't quite have his furniture at that stage. So this is something that is bugging him. You know, he's in Orvez, he's kind of getting going, but his furniture hasn't arrived. And that's pulling him mentally, in a way, back to All and back to Saint-Remy. And so even though he's in Orvez, his mind is sort of traveling to All in a way, involuntarily, to where's my furniture, if that makes sense. He goes on to say, I'm beginning to believe that I must consider the furniture lost. He says, as far as I can imagine, my friends where it is won't put themselves out to send it to me, as I'm no longer there. It's above all the traditional laziness and the old traditional story that on their side strangers who pass through leave the temporary furniture in the place where it is. But I've just written to them again for the 3rd time that I've urgent need of it. I said in my letter that I didn't have news of them, that if I didn't have news of them I would feel obliged to send them a louis for the cost of sending it. That's a coin. A louis is a coin worth 20 francs. I think it's a demand saying that you give me some money, I guess. He says that will probably have some effect, but it's impolite. One kind of has the impression from this letter that he still hasn't heard from Mrs. Genu, but I kind of get the sense that he had heard from them, and that even though they'd said they were going to send it through, he didn't seem to put much stake in that. I don't know if I'm right about this, but I don't know whether he had already read the letter, but it seems like he had. He just seems quite pessimistic about it. I mean, he does say, I've just written to them again for the 3rd time. So, you know. Anyway, he says, what can you do in the south? It isn't entirely as it is in the north. The people there do what they want and don't give themselves the trouble of thinking or paying attention to others if one isn't there. The moment you're in Paris, it's like being in the other world, and I think that they've probably won't put themselves out, all the more so because they won't like to get more mixed up in this business, which people have talked so much about in all. And what he's talking about here is what the scandal surrounding him. He calls it this business, and he's kind of saying, I don't think they're going to send me my furniture because they are tired of me. They're tired of the story around me, the stink around me, the disreputable stuff, and you know they want to get rid of reminders of me, and they don't really want to have anything to do with me. That's kind of what he's getting at. He goes on to say, it's odd all the same that the nightmare should have ceased to such an extent here. It's quite interesting. He's talking about how the people in All and especially Marie Genu are thinking about him, right, kind of negatively, and there's as if there's sort of a cloud still hanging over him because of what happened, but at the same time he kind of juxtaposes that, saying it's odd all the same the nightmare should have ceased to such an extent. He's saying when he came to Orvez, the nightmare was just gone, like the horrible thing he was going through at Saint-Remy, you know, the circumstances he was staying in, that suddenly just gone, and the people treating him kind of as a weirdo, that's also gone, and it almost also sounds as if he's referring to his own malaise, whether it's the physical malaise or mental malaise. He just refers to it as the nightmare, and he's just said it's amazing that it just ceased, it's gone away like completely. And then he adds, and very interestingly, he says, I always told Mr. Perron that the return to the north would rid me of it, but odd too that it had got rather worse under the latter's supervision, although he's very capable and definitely wished me well. So what he's saying here is he's not painting a very flattering portrait, I mean metaphorically, of Perron, basically saying, look, I think he's a good guy, but he's a capable guy, but what was strange was while I was under his supervision, I actually got worse. So it's almost like he's saying, I don't know how he treated me and what was going on, but I actually got sicker while I was, under his care. Then he says, on my side too, it causes me distress to stir all this up by writing to people. So he's kind of saying, the residues, the loose ends that he's got to sort of tie up, it's causing him distress. He's not enjoying writing to people from his past, trying to get what he needs, and not getting much luck, not getting much love out of them either. He goes on to say, I thought that the little, and now he's changing the subject, he says, I thought that the little one looks well, and you too also. You must come back quickly. So that's kind of a random comment in the middle of all of that. He's talking about distress, and then the next thing he sort of jumps to say, you guys all looked well, and you must come again quickly. And I don't think they did. I don't think he did see them after that in Orvez, and certainly not soon. I think he waited so long to see them that eventually he went to see them. That's how it turned out. And whether you think Van Gogh committed suicide or was murdered, one does wonder, if he saw his family a little bit more often, like let's say just 2 additional weekends, could that have changed the outcome? I mean, can you imagine if Vincent van Gogh, this incredible artist, had lived just another year? I mean, he painted like 70 paintings in the last 2 months of his life. Can you imagine what he could have produced if he lived another year? Just one more year, or even just another half year. Just so tragic, just so sad. On the other hand, one might say, well, without that tragedy, would he have become so famous? Would his story have become well known? Would he have been remembered? Would he have been noticed? And unfortunately, the answer to that is possibly he wouldn't have. You need these sort of extreme things for it to catch on in the public mind, or in the, well, not necessarily the public mind, but the minds of people. And it makes you kind of wonder, are there other Van Goghs out there as well? Unrecognized, unremembered, unheralded. So having spoken about how well everyone looks, he then seems to sort of jump back to some other matters. He says, as regards a carrier, there's none from here directly to Paris, but there is one from Pontoise. I think when he says carrier, I think he's not sure whether he's talking about a furniture person who would convey furniture, or more like a courier, like an art courier. He says, now there's one every day from Pontoise to here. So Pontoise is another station, which is down the road from Shoppin Well. I can't be confident when I say this, but as far as I know, Pontoise is sort of the end of one line, and then you need to change there to get on to Orvez-sur-Oise, which is on another line. But Pontoise is sort of where one of the lines from Paris terminates. Anyway, he goes on to say, so please would you ask Père Tanguy to set to work with all speed to take all the nails out of the canvases that are on stretching frames up there in the attic. He can make rolls of the canvases, parcels of the stretching frames. So these are just practical matters that's going to allow him to maintain his pace of work, and he's kind of just making arrangements with his brother in that respect. He goes on to say, then either I'll send the carrier from Pontoise, or else I'll come in a fortnight one time with Mr. Gachet and take some. So yeah, he's already referring to possibly visiting Paris. He says, you'll either send the carrier. So it sounds like what he's talking about is how he's going to get his art to his brother. How he's going to get all of these paintings that he's going to churn out. How he's going to transport that to Paris. And he says, I'm either going to send it via carrier or I'll bring it to you personally. I'll come in a fortnight, meaning in about 2 weeks, with Mr. Gachet. And I guess what he means to happen there is he'll carry some and so will the doctor. He doesn't really mention much about Mr. Gachet here, except that he assumes that they'll travel together to Paris. He goes on to say, at your place too, in the pile under the bed, I've seen many that I can retouch, I believe, to their advantage. I really regret not seeing the Raffaelli exhibition. I would especially also like to see your arrangement of those drawings on cretonne, as you were saying. So bear in mind, he's an artist. Vincent van Gogh's an artist. His brother's an art dealer, and his brother is arranging art exhibitions constantly. And so the question is, Vincent, are you well enough to come and attend an exhibition and mix with the arty-farties? Are you up to that? And that's all up to Vincent. It's up to him if he wants to show his one ear out in public, or his loss of the one ear, whether he feels he's truly cured, whether he feels he's healthy, whether he feels he's up to it. But he's certainly in the area where he can make the decision if he chooses to. He goes on to say, I would especially also like to see your arrangement of those drawings on, something I already said. Then he goes on to say, one day or another, I believe I'll find a way to do an exhibition of myself in a cafe. Those are very sad words, tragic words, given what actually happened, because after Vincent's death, no church would take him in, believing that he committed suicide. They believed it was sort of an abomination. So once again, there's a scandal surrounding him. And so because no church would take his body was laid in state in the Revue Inn, and all of his artworks were sort of exhibited around him. So he did have an exhibition, but he wasn't there. He wasn't alive to enjoy it. That's a very sad thing, isn't it? He goes on saying, I wouldn't detest exhibiting with Chéret, who must certainly have ideas on that more soon. And then he ends off saying, I shake your hand firmly, wishing you good fortune, especially with the little one. Yours truly, Vincent. Okay, I'm not going to take it further than that. When I was in Orvez, I went down to Shoppin Well. I took photos of that little station there. The building in the old photos from 1890 and the building that's there today still look very, very similar. I think a lot of the other structures look different. The kind of the streets that are there, and the rose bushes that have since grown into giants, almost like trees, at the roadside. And I think that has changed a little, but by and large, I think Orvez hasn't necessarily changed that much. Certainly not as much as a lot of other rural towns may have done. I think people try to preserve the picturesque, cottagey nature of the place, and I think they've done that quite well. Shops and so on are all sort of within the same kind of old housey theme. That makes sense. Even like pizzerias, like I bought food at a pizzeria, and it looked like an old building from the outside, and it's nice when people do that. Although it can sometimes be difficult to tell the difference between shops and residences, especially late at night, which is when I went. Okay, so that's it. I'll be back tomorrow with another letter, and this will be a letter to Joseph and Mary Genou from Orvez on the 11th. And what's so interesting about this letter is this is Vincent in Orvez, recovered on the mend somewhere else, and is now writing to characters he knows from his past. And so that's also what he's going to address, is his past. And he's also going to address how he feels about his irritation about not getting his furniture. So how is he dealing with that with these people? And so another thing that's really interesting in that letter is how he talks about Dr. Gachet, and also how he has stopped drinking. So the fact that he's actually, addressing these people from his past, and he's kind of acknowledging on paper, he's saying to them, I've stopped drinking. Isn't that like an admission that he was drinking heavily to begin with? So this whole idea that he may have abused absinthe or alcohol, he may have drunk it to excess. It's not a rumor. I mean, here he is referring to it himself. So it very much is part of, I think, what went wrong with Van Gogh with Gogh. He probably got drunk and then made a nuisance of himself, and a real nuisance of himself, and Gogh kind of was disgusted and sickened, and tried to get out of that situation, perhaps even violently. Perhaps Van Gogh was violent. Perhaps Van Gogh was just crazed or something like that. So anyway, we're going to deal with that tomorrow. And I'm sure you'll agree, with every passing letter we're getting a more concrete sense of who we're dealing with, of who Van Gogh was, of who he was becoming, and of who he is at this time in Orvez. And I'm sure you'll agree it's really interesting just how much we find out through these letters of what we need to know of the character and the identity of this particular person. And just once again, is there any sign in these letters of someone who's despairing, who's hopeless, who's saying that he's unhappy or anything like that? Has there been any sign so far? I don't see it. And so once again, you've got to ask, if that's not there, what else could be happening? And we're going to be touching on that through the course of the next couple of letters. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do. Stay safe. Make sure you're looking after your immunity, eating well, sleeping, getting enough sleep. And I'll see you guys next time.